I wanted to start by just mentioning two of the most common questions that I'm asked. Who are you and what are you doing here? So, in the best AA tradition, my name is Simon Groth and I'm a writer. I started out as a short story writer and I moved on to novels before landing my first commercial publication as an editor. Such are the strange pathways that we take on the road to publication, I guess. But at the same time I was spending year after year holed up over a screen writing manuscript after manuscript, I was also discovering new ways to publish and to reach audiences. And the funny thing about it was I wasn't even trying. I started messing around with websites back in 1996 when Netscape was king and Yahoo was still grey and not as good as Alta Vista. I created my own proper website around about 1997, possibly including some animated GIFs. By 2005, my site had been through more redesigns and repurposes than a Commonwealth Government white paper, and it was now essentially set up as a place for readers to access all the short stories that I've been publishing elsewhere. Now, I had two reasons for doing this. First was because of the embarrassing conversations that ran along the lines of, hey, I've been published in posh literary journal A. Great, where can I buy that? The second reason was frustration at one too many rejections that said, wow, your stuff is really good. Sorry, we don't do short stories. So I took a bunch of my short stories, I made them look nice, made them look pretty, I formatted them in PDF and I uploaded them to my website. And more to place a value on the work than anything else, I put a price on them. I made them $1.50 a pop. So inadvertently, I'd set up what we would now call a digital publishing platform with e-commerce built in. And it was a really great system. It worked really well, but it was a tad ambitious. Keeping in mind, this was 2 years before the Kindle and the iPhone, and a good 5 years before the iPad. So people were, I think, a little confused. They didn't really know what it was they were buying. What do I do with this? Do I read on screen? Do I print it? What do I do? So things have further evolved since then, and now the site offers a short story collection and a novel as free digital downloads or as print on demand. So free. Obviously, I don't consider sales figures when I'm building an author platform. You see, the purpose of my site has never really been about to make money. It's been to build readership. And that's something you'll find that I bang on about endlessly these days. And that's because all this writing and experimentation and muttering to myself has led me to If Book Australia. So If Book is the Institute for the Future of the Book, and it's a specialist unit within the Queensland Writers' Centre dedicated to promoting new forms of literature and ways of connecting writers with readers. It is, let me assure you, an awesome job. And I mean that in every sense of the word. And that's because we, and by that I mean society in general, have begun the monumental task of radically changing how books are made. Now, you may have noticed this yourself, but things are moving pretty fast. In the roughly 12 months since the iPad, discussion around the future of the book, at least in my world, has moved on from paper versus screen and onto what I would argue is a more mature and nuanced debate, usually around the various roles in the book supply chain and how those roles are impacted, what opportunities and what challenges there are to people like publishers and booksellers in the digital world. In mainstream forums, however, those discussions are drowned out by the reflexive cries of increasingly shrill, self-appointed defenders of the book who sneer at digital reading while claiming that the book is inherently superior, presumably because it's their preferred medium, which I guess means that they assume they're inherently superior. And it's usually from these kind of howlers that we keep hearing the argument that I'm railing against today. And that argument is this: that an important distinction between print books and their electronic siblings is smell. It's a curiously sticky idea once it's out there. So many conversations I have with people on the topic of book futures, and these are people who are in no way howlers themselves, but eventually the conversation will wind around to the statement, oh, but you don't get the smell from ebooks. Sometimes I can sense it coming. You just brace yourself in anticipation of it. You may have even found yourself cracking open a copy of let's say, To Kill a Mockingbird. And maybe, furtively check if anyone's watching, and then stick your nose into it, really deep down near the spine, and just take a good whiff of that pulp. So ingrained has this idea become in the popular imagination that at If Book we've come up with the most logical conclusion. If the smell of books holds such a strong appeal, then maybe we should bottle it. So say hello to Odour de Livres, the new fragrance from If Book Australia. I'll adopt my fragrance voice for this bit. Odour de Livres takes its essence from the rarest of mould spores collected from flood-affected libraries, aged oak pulp and the highest quality offset lithographic ink, all washed in the tears of Borders executives and distilled and reduced to a perfect tincture. Odour de Livres can be applied to any environment or worn on the skin for that hint of intellectual muskiness, or for first dates with sexy librarians. Better yet, with our patent-pending dispenser technology, you can bring the full smelling experience to your ebooks, regardless of your preferred e-reading device. So, that's Odour de Livres. Now, at If Book, we pretty much tossed this idea around as a bit of a piss take. But when we finished laughing, we started Googling. And that's when the exasperation really set in. You see, not only is there an aerosol version of the smell of books, in a can, by the way, that looks like the kind of thing that should be on the windowsill of a Besser brick toilet block, but there is a proper fragrance under consideration by no less a figure than Karl Lagerfeld. Yeah, Lagerfeld is developing something called paper passion. I am not making this up. Lagerfeld is a serious bibliophile, apparently. Good for him. But I wanted to share this with you. Consider this Exhibit A for the prosecution. This is a photograph of Karl Lagerfeld inside a hotel suite made entirely of chocolate. There are a few things to take note of here. You could note the quasi-African mask, there for no apparent reason. You could note that Lagerfeld himself seems to have no reflective properties whatsoever, and you would be forgiven for wondering if he too is made of chocolate. But all that stuff, it would be weird enough were it not for the chocolate man, arranged in a suggestive pose on the bed. Why is that chocolate man there? And why is he wearing a loincloth? Is this the kind of thing that people find in high-class hotel suites? I don't know the circumstances in which this photo came to exist, but I do know, I actually have no idea why Lagerfeld is standing there, by the way. He's apparently unperturbed by the fact that he's found himself inside some kind of weird Willy Wonka fantasy. What I do know, though, is that this photograph represents a warning. If you're guilty of making reference to the smell of books, if you're guilty of this misuse of your olfactory sense, then I want you to think about those cold, dead chocolate eyes of the mostly naked loincloth man. And I want you to reconsider the kind of company you're keeping. In other words, my advice for you today is simply this: get over it. If the smell of books was really that intoxicating, we'd dispense with reading altogether and just wander libraries running our noses along the shelves. Bookshops would pump out Odour de Livres from their entrance, a bit like cinemas do with popcorn. And connoisseurs would, of course, bore each other with endless detailed analyses of variations by region or era. Honestly, the 1963 Penguins carry far more cinnamon and a little less wet dog than their 1974 counterparts. Books have many amazing qualities as an incredibly efficient and proven means of storing ideas, knowledge and stories. They are not a vehicle for transporting odour, although some of them may do so inadvertently. At If Book's recent symposium, Rory McLeod, the head of the State Library of Queensland's Heritage Collection, described the smell of books as the smell of death. And he wasn't kidding. The smell that's fetishised by bibliophiles and occasional chocolate sweet hotel guests is the smell of paper ageing, disintegrating. It's the smell of knowledge disappearing. It's a smell that's completely anathema to libraries. So, what's really going on here? Referring to the smell of books, I think, is an emotional tug. It's something designed to appeal to bibliophiles who are anxious that their preferred medium might be disappearing. Once, it might have been a useful analogy, but now, just a lazy cliche. And in fact, I'm wondering if we need to create a digital publishing version of Godwin's Law. Now, for those of you who don't know, Godwin's law is a very old internet meme, and it comes from Mike Godwin, who said, "As an online discussion grows longer, the probability of a comparison involving Nazis or Hitler approaches 1. In other words, given enough time, any online discussion, regardless of topic or scope, someone inevitably criticises a point made in the discussion by comparing it to beliefs held by Hitler and the Nazis. Further to this, many believe that by invoking Godwin's law, all debate instantly ceases and the person who actually uttered the H or the N word instantly loses the argument." So, applying this to digital publishing, the if book law states, "The point at which someone references the smell of books is the point at which all rational discussion has ended. At best you could wait half an hour and come back, but probably better just to get on with your life." Now, Odour de Livres really is just the latest example of a sustained and passionate defence of books. Annie Proulx in 1994 dismissed e-readers with this wonderfully bitchy line. She said, "No one wants to read on a twitchy little screen." I don't know if she said it in that tone of voice, but I always put that tone of voice on there. Now, to her credit, she was right about that. No one wanted to read on a twitchy little screen. The only problem is that the screens aren't quite so little or twitchy anymore. On the other hand, we head further back to 1978, we discover that Douglas Adams imagined The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as a sort of electronic book. No one even then found it credible that an interstellar hitchhiker would be caught out with something as primitive as a beat-up old copy of Let's Go Alpha Centauri, let alone the Encyclopaedia Galactica, with which the eponymous guide is frequently and favourably compared. But my personal favourite in this long, strange trench warfare comes from the French writer Octave Uzan, who wrote, "If by books you are to be understood as referring to our innumerable collections of paper, printed, sewed and bound in a cover announcing the title of the work, then I own to you frankly that I do not believe, and the progress of electricity and modern mechanism forbids me to believe, that Gutenberg's invention can do otherwise than sooner or later fall into destitute as a means of current interpretation of our mental products. Notwithstanding the enormous progress which has gradually been made in the printing press, it still appears to me that the art has attained its acme of perfection, and that our grandchildren will no longer trust their works to this somewhat antiquated process, now become very easy to replace by phonography, which is yet in its initial stage, and of which we have much to hope." You might have guessed by the language this is a while back. This was 1894, and in what I believe is a fairly dodgy translation from the French. So in modern English, Uzan believed that sound recording, still at this stage on wax cylinders, was going to be the killer app that would finally render the print book obsolete. So, again, what's really going on here? Why have we always been so apparently nervous about technology superseding books? Clearly it hasn't happened yet. Why do we think it's going to now? Here's a small clue. I was recently required to review the Kindle. Now, the device has been out forever in tech terms, so there was really little that I could bring to the table that hadn't already been said plenty of times over. So in blatant disregard of child labour laws, I gave it to my son. He's 6 and just learning to read. So I downloaded one of his favourite mini chapter books, and I let him figure out the device for himself, which, after a moment of stabbing at the screen with his finger, he got the hang of pretty quickly. I asked him about the experience of reading on a screen. Did he like it better or worse than his books? He shrugged and said, no, it was much the same. So I pressed him for an answer, and eventually he plumbed for his books, because they had colour covers in 3D with glasses. But the thing that struck me about his responses was he honestly couldn't understand my line of questioning. They were both books. What was the big deal with having to choose one over another? I don't want to make too light of this, but discussion of digital impact on publishing is serious, and there are real reputations and livelihoods at stake. But, this is precisely why all those howlers really need to move on so that the grown-ups can start talking. Though technology has famously been defined as stuff that doesn't work yet, we're increasingly used to a broader definition of technology to include the stuff that works just fine. So let's just briefly contrast the technologies. Books are a proven means of communicating across distance and time. Made very well, they last a really long time. and it's pretty easy to figure out how they work. Though, on the other side, individual books might be nice and portable, but in quantity they're heavy and cumbersome. Now, considering ebooks, they're not limited to a single container. They weigh nothing, and the text is resizable and machine readable, which opens up reading for people who've previously had to rely on others to create large print or audio books. And if digital brings nothing else to the table, that's its most important contribution. On the other hand, it hasn't been around long enough to prove its permanence. We really don't know how long this stuff is going to last. And it requires a reading device, which in turn brings all the other stuff that reading devices bring to the table. Now, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, and I'm really just scratching the surface here, but there's a picture forming. And the picture is that the differences are mostly in the margins. The differences in circumstances or in style. In fact, there's a hell of a lot of crossover in what these two technologies do really well. So, for the first time in a long time, readers have a genuine choice in how they access text. Some will move wholesale into new formats. Others may stay with tried and true. But I suspect still more will likely just move between the two, depending on what the text is that they're reading. You weigh up what you value most, and you go with it. People might look at my son and extrapolate all sorts of doom and gloom for publishing. But you know what? I just see a child who loves to read. It's no secret that we form an emotional attachment to books, and it's this attachment that has ingrained itself really quite deeply in our culture. We're a society built not so much on books, but on the ideas that are contained within them. And the very thought that this bedrock of our culture might disappear, even if it happens over generations, leads us to a pretty irrational fear at what might get lost in that process. And it's this fear that we express as a desire for the accoutrements of reading. The sound of the spine cracking slightly on opening, the sound of pages flicking, the search for that perfect reading position, and the smell. All of it is illusion. You don't love the smell as much as you think you do. And the greatest smell in the world won't save you from poorly written tripe. Mein Kampf smells much the same as Moby Dick. Oh, bugger. I just invoked Godwin's law, didn't I? Thank you for listening.